Okay, so we're on page 11. Analysis of Act 1, the agreement. So Mrs. J is having twins. The logical thing to do is to give one to that woman whose house you've just started cleaning. It's a lovely house after all. What could possibly go wrong? So there are twins on the way. Okay, so when Mrs. Johnson finds out that she's expecting twins, she is numbed by the news, so she's in shock. Her shock makes her vulnerable when Mrs. Lyons tells her, "Give one to me." Okay, so this is where Mrs. Lyons really manipulates Mrs. Johnstone. Mrs. Johnstone doesn't show any sympathy for Mrs. Johnstone's situations. Sorry, Mrs. Lyons doesn't show any sympathy for Mrs. Johnstone's situation. She puts a cushion up her dress and plans what she'll tell her husband before Mrs. Johnstone has even agreed. So she really gets carried away. She doesn't even listen to Mrs. Johnstone at this point. She doesn't listen whether she says yes or no. She just takes it for granted, and she uses her superiority to manipulate that situation. And Mrs. Lyons then pressures Mrs. Johnstone to agree. So she interrupts her as she says, "You can't just," and she doesn't give her a chance to think or refuse. She uses imperatives. An imperative is something, it's important, it's very, very important. And she uses words, phrases such as "tell me" and look, and she controls the conversation. She makes promises about the life that she'll give the child, such as he'd have all his own toys, and this is what Mrs. Johnstone has been dreaming about, and she just thinks that that would just be the best thing for her child. She tells Mrs. Johnstone that she can see the child every day. This is quite a white lie. She's made this promise and she doesn't even know whether she'll be able to keep that. And she nods enthusiastically. So this is non-verbal communication. So she's telling her that it's a good idea. And that's in order to influence Mrs. Johnstone's decision. She twists what Mrs. Johnstone has told her and uses it to play on her fears. So this is again manipulation, asking, how can you possibly avoid some of them being put into care? So what she's saying here is, if you don't give me one of your twins, you can't afford to live properly on the money that you earn for 2 more babies. So the only thing that's going to happen is you're going to lose all of your children, whereas if you give one to me, you'd be able to keep the rest, and the other one is going to be living a life of luxury. So it's a win-win situation, but that's not always the case. She's guessing that that is what is going to happen. So Mrs. Johnstone only nods her agreement. She's very reluctant, but she doesn't actually say it. She's kind of mirroring her non-verbal communication for Mrs. Lyons. And this shows that she's reluctant, but she feels she has no choice. She's kind of cornered, isn't she? Mrs. Lyons immediately puts the plan into action. She doesn't stop at all. She doesn't give Mrs. Johnstone the chance to think about her decision. She doesn't say, "I'll give you time to think about it." You know, she jumps on that opportunity. Well, she kind of tentatively says, "Well, okay." So the writer's techniques here. So the narrator refers to a thought conceived and a deal born, linking the plan to pregnancy. So obviously, when you conceive a child, that's the first part of making it, and that's the first part of this idea. And a deal was born, and of course, children are born. So you need to remember this writer's technique in your in-depth answers. So this is a key scene. Mrs. Lyons takes Edward. Okay, so if you remember, if you've watched the play, Mrs. Johnstone doesn't actually hand over one of them. She asks Mrs. Lyons to take one. So when the time comes to give one of the twins up, Mrs. Johnstone is reluctant, telling Mrs. Lyons that they're a pair, they go together. That's her last effort of trying to get her to change her mind. But Mrs. Lyons plays on her superstitious nature by reminding her that she swore on the Bible. Okay, so another writer's technique, the structure of it is the debt collectors are waiting for Mrs. Johnstone when she gets home from the hospital. So again, this is just another thing where She's in up to her neck with debt, and she can't afford both babies. So this highlights the parallels between her financial debt and her pregnancy, and she can't afford to keep her belongings, just as she can't afford to keep both twins. So later, Mrs. Lyons' paranoia begins to grow when she sees Mrs. Johnstone fussing over the babies. This is the bit where she goes back to work. And this is the start of her deep-seated insecurity about her relationship with Edward. She knows she's not her own mother, but she knows that she's come from a mother that is a working-class family. So she thinks she can solve the problem by sacking Mrs. Johnstone. So there's a theme here. This is a theme, remember, is a drip, drip, drip of ideas. And this is money and social class that runs the way through the play. So money gives Mrs. Lyons power. It allows her to employ and sack Mrs. Johnstone. Her class also gives her leverage. So that means that she'll always have one up on Mrs. Johnstone. She knows that if the matter went to the police, they would believe her over Mrs. Johnstone. So if Mrs. Johnstone said, well, do you know what, I'm going to go to the police, then, Mrs. Lyons is most likely to be believed. And that's shown as well later in the play when the children are throwing stones and swearing at the policemen, and the way that the policemen deal with both of the Mickey and Edward, they're very, very different. And we'll cover that later on in the book. Mrs. Lyons invents the superstition that the twins will die if either twin learns that he was once a pair. She wants to scare Mrs. Johnstone into never telling the boys the truth. So she's used, and again this is a manipulation of Mrs. Lyons with Mrs. Johnstone. And at the bottom of the page here, a key quote you need to remember: kids can't live on love alone. And you're not wrong there, Mrs. J. The narrator's already had a pop at her, saying that she has a heart of stone, and remember that was in the first scene. But really she knows that she can't afford to look after both twins. She's just doing what she thinks is best. Okay, you need to remember that quote.